Jake Morrison was counting his final heartbeats tied to a baobab tree with no water and no hope when the male lion emerged from the golden grass. The apex predator circled once, studied the dying cowboy with those impossible eyes, and made a choice that would shock wildlife experts around the world. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Jake Morrison never imagined his last day on Earth would begin with the smell of acacia trees and the distant roar of something that had no business existing in the same world as his worn leather boots and faded Stetson. The rope bit into his wrists with a familiar cruelty, the kind he'd felt 100 times working cattle back in Montana. But this time, there would be no quick release, no friendly hand to loosen the knots. This time, the rope was meant to hold him until the Savannah claimed what was left of his foolish American dreams. The baobab tree behind him stood ancient and indifferent, its massive trunk providing the only shade for miles in any direction. Through the dancing heat waves that rose from the golden grass, he could see the distant purple mountains that marked the edge of the Serengeti, beautiful and utterly unreachable. His throat was raw from shouting, his voice long since given up trying to call for help that would never come. The men who had left him here, locals hired by the very expedition he'd paid good money to join, had made it clear that Jake Morrison's curiosity about their smuggling operation would be his last mistake. 24 hours ago, he had been sitting in a Land Rover, camera in hand, living out the adventure he'd dreamed about since he was a boy reading National Geographic in his father's study. Now he was counting the minutes until sunset, when the real predators would emerge from whatever shadows they called home during the brutal African afternoon. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd spent 32 years avoiding danger on his family's ranch, only to find it 6,000 miles from home, tied to a tree like some character in a bad Western film, transplanted to the wrong continent entirely. Before we continue with what happened next, take a moment to imagine yourself in Jake's position. And if this story grabs you, make sure you stay with us, because what happened when that lion appeared defied everything we think we know about the animal kingdom. The sun was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon when Jake first heard it. Not the roar that would make his blood run cold, but something quieter, more curious. A low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath him, through the trunk of the tree that held him captive, through the rope that bound his arms behind his back until they'd gone numb hours ago. He'd been drifting in and out of consciousness, the dehydration and heat exhaustion playing tricks with his mind, showing him mirages of water and rescue that dissolved like smoke whenever he tried to focus on them. The sound came again, closer this time, and Jake forced his eyes open despite the crusted salt from dried sweat that made the simple act of seeing an effort. What he saw made his heart stop completely for one terrible, perfect moment. A male lion, perhaps 300 pounds of muscle and teeth and evolutionary perfection, was moving through the tall grass with the kind of purpose that meant it had already decided Jake was worth investigating. The magnificent mane caught the afternoon light like spun gold, and those amber eyes were fixed on him with an intelligence that was somehow more terrifying than simple hunger would have been. Jake had read about lions, of course. Every tourist who came to Africa did their research, learned about the apex predators that ruled these ancient grasslands. He knew that male lions typically let the females do the hunting, that they were territorial and dangerous, and killed roughly 200 people every year across the continent. He knew that playing dead wouldn't help, that running was impossible even if he could get free, that his life was measured now in heartbeats rather than hours. What the books hadn't told him was how beautiful death would look when it came walking through the golden savanna grass. How peaceful he would feel in these last moments, watching nature's perfect killer close the distance between them. The lion stopped 10 feet away, its massive head tilting slightly as it studied this strange creature tied to a tree. Jake could see the individual whiskers, the slight tear in one ear that spoke of old battles, the powerful muscles that shifted beneath the tawny coat with every breath. They stared at each other across that small distance, predator and prey, locked in a moment that seemed to exist outside of normal time. Jake found himself thinking about his daughter, Emma, back in Montana, probably feeding the horses right about now, completely unaware that her father was about to become a statistic in a continent he'd had no business visiting in the first place. His ex-wife Sarah had been right about this trip, as she'd been right about so many things during their marriage. She'd called it his midlife crisis, this sudden need to see the world beyond the fence lines of the Morrison Ranch. Maybe she'd been right. Maybe this whole adventure had been nothing more than a middle-aged man running from responsibilities and routines that had started to feel like a prison sentence. The thought almost made him laugh, but his throat was too dry for laughter, too raw from the dust and heat and hours of useless shouting. The lion took another step forward, and Jake closed his eyes, not wanting to see the moment when those jaws opened, when the experiment of his life came to its inevitable, violent conclusion. He thought about Emma's graduation next month, the one he'd promised to attend, the speech he'd been planning about following your dreams and taking risks. Well, he'd certainly taken a risk. He'd followed a dream right into a nightmare, and now his daughter would grow up knowing her father had died alone tied to a tree, food for whatever scavengers came after the lion had taken its fill. Some legacy that would be for a Montana rancher who'd spent his whole life playing it safe until the one moment he'd decided to be brave. The heat pressed down like a physical weight, and Jake felt himself slipping away again, consciousness becoming optional in a situation where staying aware meant facing the terror of his imminent death. But something made him open his eyes one more time, some stubborn part of his rancher's soul that refused to go gentle into whatever darkness waited. What he saw in those final moments would change everything he thought he knew about survival, about nature, about the thin line between civilization and the wild places that still existed in the world. The lion was not attacking. It was sitting, haunches settled into the dry grass, tail flicking occasionally at flies, watching him with an expression that could almost be called curious. Jake blinked, certain the dehydration had finally pushed him into hallucination. But when he opened his eyes again, the lion was still there, still sitting, still studying him with those impossibly golden eyes. The great cat's ears were forward, alert, but not aggressive, and its body language spoke of interest rather than hunger. Jake had spent enough time around animals on the ranch to recognize the difference between a creature deciding whether to kill something and one simply trying to understand what it was looking at. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time had become meaningless in this sun-scorched purgatory where a Montana cowboy sat bound to an African tree while a lion watched him like he was the most fascinating thing it had ever encountered. Jake's mind raced through possibilities, each more unlikely than the last. Maybe the lion wasn't hungry. Maybe it had eaten recently and was simply curious about this strange two-legged creature that smelled of fear and desperation and the particular scent of American deodorant that had long since failed in the African heat. Maybe, and this thought came with a strange mixture of hope and resignation, the lion was waiting for him to die naturally before claiming its meal, patient in the way only apex predators could afford to be. The sun continued its descent, painting the Savannah in shades of amber and gold that would have been breathtaking if Jake had any capacity left for appreciating beauty. His thoughts kept drifting to Emma, to the ranch, to all the things he'd left undone in his hurry to have this grand adventure. He'd promised his foreman, old Tom Parker, that he'd be back in 3 weeks to help with the spring calving. Tom had shaken his head at the whole idea of Africa, muttered something about Jake having more money than sense, but he'd wished him well anyway. Now Tom would have to manage the calving alone, and Jake would become one of those cautionary tales people told about Americans who thought they could treat the whole world like a dude ranch. The lion stood and Jake's heart lurched back into terror mode, but the great cat didn't approach. Instead, It began to circle the tree, moving with that liquid grace that made it seem like it was floating rather than walking. Jake twisted his head, trying to keep the animal in sight, but the rope and his position made it impossible. He lost track of the lion for terrible seconds, imagining it approaching from behind, those jaws closing around his neck before he even knew death had arrived. But then the lion appeared again on his left side, completing its circuit, and settled back down in a different spot, closer now, close enough that Jake could see the rhythmic rise and fall of its breathing. Something was wrong with this picture, and Jake's rancher's instincts were screaming at him, even through the fog of dehydration and fear. Animals didn't behave this way. Predators didn't sit and study their prey like they were contemplating a painting in a museum. They attacked or they left, driven by hunger or the lack of it, by territorial instincts or the simple calculus of whether something was worth the effort of killing. This lion was doing neither. It was staying, watching, waiting for something that Jake couldn't begin to understand. He tried to speak, his voice coming out as a cracked whisper that barely qualified as sound. The lion's ears swiveled toward him at the noise, and those amber eyes fixed on his face with renewed intensity. "What do you want?" Jake managed to croak, the absurdity of trying to communicate with a lion not lost on him even in his desperate state. The words hung in the air between them, meaningless syllables that somehow felt necessary anyway. The lion made a sound, not a roar, but something softer, almost conversational, and Jake felt tears sting his eyes at the sheer strangeness of this moment. He was going to die here, that much seemed certain, but apparently death would be preceded by the world's most surreal interspecies encounter. The afternoon shadows were lengthening now, and Jake knew that nightfall in the Savannah would bring temperatures that would finish what the day's heat had started. He was already hypothermic in reverse, his body temperature elevated beyond safe levels, his skin burned despite the shade of the baobab tree, his organs beginning the slow process of shutting down from lack of water. The lion would be the merciful option compared to dying of exposure, and Jake found himself hoping that if the attack came, it would come soon, before the real suffering set in. His father had taught him about dying when Jake was just a boy, explained that every rancher needed to understand the difference between an animal that could be saved and one that was suffering needlessly. Mercy, his father had said, was knowing when to let go. But the lion still didn't attack. As the sun touched the horizon and the Savannah began its transformation from day to night, the great cat rose again and moved closer, so close now that Jake could smell it, a musky scent that was surprisingly not unpleasant, mixed with the smell of grass and earth and something wild that had no name in human languages. The lion sat directly in front of him, barely 3 feet separating them, and Jake could see his own reflection in those golden eyes, a broken man tied to a tree, waiting for death that refused to come quickly. They stayed like that as darkness fell, man and lion locked in a vigil that made no sense, governed by rules that existed somewhere beyond human understanding. The night brought sounds that Jake had only heard through the safety of Land Rover windows and tourist lodge walls. Hyenas whooping in the distance, their cackling laughter making his skin crawl. The bark of zebras somewhere beyond his sight. Insects that clicked and buzzed with a volume that seemed impossible for creatures so small. And through it all, the lion remained, a living guardian that made no sense in any context Jake could imagine. When other sounds came too close, the lion would turn its massive head toward the darkness and emit a low rumble that sent whatever approached scrambling away into the night. It was protecting him, Jake realized with a clarity that cut through even his dehydration-addled mind. This apex predator, this perfect killing machine, was keeping him safe from the other dangers of the African night. The absurdity of it should have made him laugh, but Jake had moved beyond laughter, into a space where nothing seemed impossible anymore. Maybe he was already dead, and this was some fever dream his dying brain had conjured up to make the end easier to bear. Maybe the men who'd tied him here had put something in his water before they'd left, some local drug that caused hallucinations of impossible friendships with wild animals. Or maybe, and this thought came with a strange kind of peace, the universe was simply more mysterious than his Montana rancher's worldview had ever allowed for. Maybe there were connections between living things that existed outside of predator and prey, outside of the neat categories humans like to impose on nature. Emma would never believe this story, even if by some miracle he survived to tell it. His daughter had inherited his practical nature, his tendency to see the world in terms of what could be measured and understood and managed. She'd loved the ranch precisely because it made sense, because cattle and horses and land followed rules that could be learned and applied. This situation, a lion sitting guard over a dying cowboy in the middle of the Serengeti, followed no rules that Jake had ever learned. It existed in a space between rational and magical, between the natural world and something that felt almost spiritual in its strangeness. The hours crawled by with the peculiar elasticity of time experienced in extremis. Jake drifted in and out of consciousness, each time surfacing to find the lion still there, still watching, still somehow keeping vigil over a man it should have killed and eaten hours ago. In his more lucid moments, Jake found himself talking to the animal, his voice a raspy whisper that barely qualified his speech. He told the lion about Montana, about mountains that wore snow caps even in summer, about rivers so cold they could steal your breath, about his daughter who was studying veterinary medicine because she'd always loved animals more than people. He told the lion about Sarah, about the divorce that had come not from any great betrayal, but simply from two people who'd grown into different shapes over 20 years of marriage, no longer fitting together the way they once had. The lion listened, or seemed to listen, its ears forward and attentive, its eyes never leaving Jake's face. Sometimes it would make that soft rumbling sound again, and Jake chose to interpret it as acknowledgement, as understanding, as the kind of communication that existed below language, in the realm where all living things recognized each other as temporary custodians of consciousness in an indifferent universe. He was probably projecting, probably assigning meaning where none existed, but in this moment between life and death, it didn't matter what was real and what was the invention of his failing mind. What mattered was that he wasn't alone. After spending so much of his life surrounded by people and still feeling isolated, he'd found companionship in the last place anyone would think to look. When the false dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Jake felt himself slipping away again, deeper this time, into a darkness that felt more permanent than sleep. His body was shutting down, systems failing one by one, like lights going out in a house whose power was being cut. He couldn't feel his hands anymore, couldn't remember the last time he'd been able to feel them. His thoughts were becoming scattered, connections failing between neurons that no longer had the resources to maintain their elaborate dance. He thought about making peace with God, but Jake had never been particularly religious, had always felt more connected to whatever divine might exist when he was standing in a field watching sunset than when he was sitting in a church pew, listening to someone else's interpretation of the sacred. "I'm sorry, Emma," he whispered, though whether he spoke out loud or just in his mind, he couldn't be sure anymore. "I wanted to come home. I wanted to see you graduate." The lion moved, and Jake felt rather than saw it come closer still. He managed to open his eyes one last time and found himself staring into those amber depths from inches away. The lion's breath was hot on his face, surprisingly sweet-smelling, and Jake felt a strange calm settle over him. If this was death, it was gentler than he'd feared. The great cat leaned forward, and Jake closed his eyes, ready now, accepting what came next with the same pragmatic resignation he'd brought to every unavoidable fact of his rancher's life. But instead of teeth, he felt something warm and rough against his cheek. The lion was licking him, its tongue like wet sandpaper, the gesture so unexpected and so tender that Jake felt tears finally break free. running down his face to mix with whatever moisture the lion was depositing. The gesture continued, methodical and gentle, and Jake understood with sudden clarity what was happening. The lion was grooming him, the way a mother would groom a cub, the way lions showed affection and care within their pride. This impossible creature had somehow decided that Jake belonged to it, that he was worth protecting, worth caring for, worth keeping alive. The tears came harder now, his body shaking with sobs that hurt his dehydrated chest, his cracked ribs protesting the movement. He had come to Africa looking for adventure, for something to make him feel alive again after years of going through motions on the ranch. He'd found it, just not in any way he could have imagined. As the sun climbed higher and the savannah came alive with morning sounds, the lion abruptly stopped its grooming and stood, its attention fixed on something in the distance that Jake couldn't see from his position against the tree. The great cat's body language changed, becoming alert, tense, and Jake felt a flutter of fear that after surviving the night, something worse was coming. The lion moved away from him, positioning itself between Jake and whatever approached, and began to emit a low, continuous growl that Jake felt in his bones. Through the shimmering heat that was already building despite the early hour, Jake could make out movement, shapes resolving into a small herd of wildebeest that were passing through, their migration patterns taking them across this particular patch of grassland. The lion watched them pass with predatory interest, but made no move to hunt, its attention divided between the potential prey and the human tied to the tree behind it. Jake understood then that the lion was choosing him over food, over the instinct that should have driven it to pursue the wildebeest. The great cat was hungry, had to be, but it wasn't leaving. It was staying with Jake for reasons that existed somewhere in the mysterious calculus of animal consciousness, in whatever prompted wild creatures to occasionally act in ways that defied every evolutionary imperative. When the wildebeest had passed, and the plain was empty again except for the scattered acacia trees and the heat waves that made everything shimmer like a mirage, the lion returned to its position in front of Jake and settled down once more. The sun was merciless as it climbed toward its zenith, and Jake knew he was running out of time. Even with the lion's inexplicable protection, dehydration would kill him soon. His lips were cracked and bleeding, his tongue swollen in his mouth, his thoughts becoming increasingly fragmented and strange. He kept seeing his father, dead now 15 years, standing in the grassland wearing his old ranch coat despite the heat, shaking his head the way he used to when Jake had done something foolish as a boy. "You always were too curious for your own good," his father said, or seemed to say. The words might have been Jake's imagination, filling in dialogue for a hallucination. "Should have stayed home where you belonged." But even as the vision spoke, Jake found he didn't regret coming to Africa. Yes, he was probably going to die here, tied to a tree in a landscape that cared nothing for his survival. But he'd seen something beautiful and impossible, had experienced a connection with a wild creature that most people would never believe was possible. He'd stepped outside the comfortable prison of his routine life and touched something real, something that existed beyond mortgages and cattle prices, and the slow accumulation of comfortable disappointments that made up most adult lives. If these were his last hours, at least they meant something. At least he would die knowing he'd been brave enough to leave Montana, even if that bravery had led him straight to this particular end. The lion's ears suddenly swiveled, catching a sound that Jake's human hearing couldn't detect. The great cat rose and turned toward the east, where the dirt road that passed within a mile of this spot carried the occasional safari vehicle or supply truck. Jake heard it then, the distant sound of an engine growing louder as it approached. The lion's tail lashed once, twice, agitation clear in every line of its powerful body. Jake tried to call out, to make some sound that might carry to whoever was driving that vehicle, but his voice was gone completely now, reduced to a wheeze that barely qualified as breath. The lion looked back at him, and Jake could have sworn he saw conflict in those golden eyes. a decision being weighed between staying and fleeing from the approaching humans. Then the great cat did something that Jake would replay in his mind for the rest of his life, however long or short that might be. It roared, a sound so loud and powerful that it seemed to shake the very earth, a declaration that could be heard for miles across the open savanna. It roared again and again, calling attention to this spot, to the tree, to the dying man who sat bound against its trunk. The lion was summoning help, Jake realized with wonder that cut through even his failing consciousness. This impossible creature was deliberately bringing humans to save the man it had protected through the long night. The vehicle's engine grew louder, changing pitch as it left the road and began bouncing across the rough terrain toward them. The lion gave Jake one last look, something passing between them that had no name in any language, then turned and loped away into the tall grass, disappearing as completely as if it had never existed at all. Jake wanted to call it back, to thank it, to ask its name even though lions didn't have names and couldn't understand human gratitude. But he had no voice left, no strength, nothing but the tears that ran down his face as he watched his savior vanish into the golden sea of grass. The Land Rover burst through the grass line, and Jake saw faces, human faces, expressions of shock and concern as they took in the scene. A woman was first out of the vehicle, moving with the quick efficiency of someone who'd dealt with emergencies before. She had dark skin weathered by years under the African sun, and her hands were gentle but firm as she checked his pulse, examined his bonds, called out instructions to her companions in a mix of English and Swahili. Jake tried to speak, to tell them about the lion, about the night of impossible vigil, but his throat produced nothing but a cracked wheeze that hurt more than helped. The woman held a water bottle to his lips, letting him take only small sips, despite his body's screaming demand for more. Slowly, she said, her accent placing her as local, as someone who belonged to this land in ways Jake never could. Too much too fast will make you sick. You are very dehydrated, very sunburned. We need to get you to hospital. Her companions, two men who moved with the casual competence of professional guides, were cutting through the ropes that had held him for over 30 hours. Jake felt his arms drop to his sides, useless appendages that no longer responded to his commands. The circulation returning to his hands brought pain that was somehow worse than the numbness had been. 1,000 needles of agony that made him gasp and nearly vomit from the intensity. The woman supported his head as the pain washed over him, murmuring something soothing in a language he didn't understand. When he could breathe again, when the worst of the circulation pain had faded to a manageable throb, she asked the question he'd been dreading. What happened to you? Who did this? Jake's mind raced through explanations, through the story of the smuggling ring he'd discovered, the men who'd left him to die rather than risk him reporting them to authorities. But all of that seemed secondary, irrelevant compared to what had happened after they'd left him. He tried again to speak, managed to force out a single word that came out as barely more than a whisper. Lion. The three rescuers exchanged glances, and Jake could see the concern in their eyes, the worry that the sun and dehydration had affected his mind. The woman felt his forehead, checking for fever. You're very hot, she said gently. Sometimes the heat makes people see things that are not there. It is okay. You are safe now. No, Jake wanted to shout but couldn't. Not a hallucination. Real. The lion was real. But he had no strength for arguments, no way to make them understand that the impossible had happened, that a wild predator had chosen mercy over instinct, companionship over hunger, protection over predation. They lifted him carefully into the Land Rover, and the movement brought fresh waves of pain from muscles that had been locked in one position for too long. Jake heard one of the men say something about tracks, about lion prints around the tree, and felt a surge of vindication even through his haze of pain and exhaustion. Dr. Kamau, the woman said, indicating one of the men, he says there are lion tracks everywhere. Very fresh. You were lucky it did not find you. Or maybe, and she made a gesture Jake interpreted as religious, maybe God was watching over you. Jake wanted to laugh at the cosmic joke of it all. They thought he'd been lucky to avoid the lion's notice, had no idea that the lion's notice was the only reason he was still alive. If that great cat hadn't kept vigil, hadn't frightened away the hyenas and whatever else had come sniffing in the night, hadn't deliberately called for help with those final roars, Jake would be nothing but bones and torn fabric by now. But he had no way to explain, no voice to tell them that God might have been watching over him, but God had worked through 300 pounds of predator with amber eyes and a heart that defied every law of nature Jake had ever learned. The drive to the nearest hospital took 3 hours, bouncing along roads that were barely more than suggestions carved into the landscape. Jake drifted in and out of consciousness, his body shutting down systems now that rescue had come, now that the adrenaline that had kept him functioning was no longer necessary. In his dreams, he saw the lion again, sitting in the grass watching him with those impossibly intelligent eyes. In his dreams, he understood that the lion had been thanking him for something, though Jake couldn't imagine what a human could do that would earn gratitude from such a creature. Maybe it was the other way around. Maybe Jake should be thanking the lion for teaching him something about the world that his practical Montana rancher's worldview had never allowed for. The hospital in Arusha was small but efficient, staffed by doctors and nurses who'd seen every kind of emergency the African wilderness could produce. They hooked Jake up to IV fluids, treated his sunburn and dehydration, examined the rope burns on his wrists, and the damage done by over 30 hours in the same position. A young doctor with kind eyes and a British accent explained that he'd been very lucky, that another few hours would likely have caused irreversible organ damage, that he'd been found just in time. The word lucky kept coming up, and each time Jake heard it, he thought about the lion, about how luck had nothing to do with his survival. When he could finally speak again, when the fluids had rehydrated him enough that his voice worked in something approaching normal fashion, Jake tried to tell his story. The police came first, wanting details about the men who'd tied him to the tree, about the smuggling operation he'd discovered. Jake told them everything he could remember, gave descriptions and names and the location where he'd seen the illegal ivory and pangolin scales being loaded into trucks, bearing the logo of what was supposed to be a legitimate conservation group. But when he tried to explain about the lion, about the vigil and the protection and the deliberate calling for help, he saw the same skeptical expressions he'd seen on his rescuers' faces. The lead investigator, a tired-looking man named Inspector Omondi, wrote down Jake's account with the patient tolerance of someone humoring a trauma victim. "Mr. Morrison," he said carefully when Jake had finished, "you have been through a terrible ordeal. The mind does strange things when the body is under such stress. Perhaps what you experienced was a kind of waking dream, a way of coping with the fear and isolation." Jake wanted to argue, wanted to insist that every detail was real, but he could see it was useless. These were practical men dealing with practical crimes, and they had no room in their worldview for miracles disguised as predators. The story made the news, of course. "American rancher nearly dies after discovering smuggling ring," the headlines read, "saved just in time by local safari guides." The wire services picked it up, and suddenly Jake's phone, retrieved from his abandoned belongings at the safari camp, was flooded with messages from Emma, from Sarah, from friends and neighbors back in Montana who'd seen his name attached to a dramatic story from half a world away. Emma was the first person he spoke to when the doctors finally allowed him phone calls. Her voice, shaking with relief and anger and fear that had finally found its outlet, came through with crystal clarity despite the thousands of miles between them. "Dad, what were you thinking?" she demanded through tears he could hear even if he couldn't see them. "You could have died. You almost did die. Why didn't you just come home when you first suspected something was wrong?" Jake had no good answer for that. No way to explain the stubbornness that had made him investigate instead of retreat, the same trait that had probably kept him alive during that long night by the baobab tree. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," he said, his own voice rough with emotion. "I'm sorry I scared you, but I'm okay now. I'm going to be fine." She made him promise to come home as soon as the doctors cleared him for travel, made him swear he wouldn't do anything else dangerous or stupid or adventurous without at least telling her first. He agreed to everything, would have agreed to anything, just to hear the relief in her voice when she finally believed he was truly going to be okay. Sarah called next, her tone less emotional but no less concerned. "Jake," she said, and in those two syllables he heard echoes of their 20 years together, of all the times she'd worried about him doing something reckless on the ranch, of all the close calls that ranching life had brought their way. "I always knew your curiosity would get you into trouble someday, but I never imagined it would be in Africa." He almost told her about the lion then, almost tried to explain the inexplicable, but something stopped him. Sarah had always been the practical one, the one who dealt in facts and evidence and things that could be proven. She would react the same way everyone else had, with concerned skepticism and subtle suggestions that trauma had affected his perception of events. Instead, he thanked her for calling, assured her he'd be home soon, and ended the conversation before the emotion could overwhelm his still fragile state. 3 days in the hospital gave Jake plenty of time to think, to process what had happened, to try to make sense of an experience that defied sense. The doctors and nurses came and went, checking his vitals, adjusting his medications, telling him how lucky he'd been. That word again, lucky, as if chance alone had determined his survival. Jake knew better. He'd looked into the eyes of something wild and ancient and impossible, and that something had chosen to save him instead of kill him. There was no luck involved, only a mystery so profound that it might never be explained by any framework humans had developed for understanding the natural world. On the 4th morning, a visitor arrived who changed everything. Dr. Abasi Mwangi was a wildlife biologist who'd heard about Jake's story and wanted to talk to him about the lion. He was an older man, probably in his 60s, with gray hair and eyes that held the kind of wisdom that came from decades of patient observation. He sat beside Jake's hospital bed and listened without interruption as Jake told the complete story, every detail he could remember from that long night, from the lion's first appearance to its final roar before loping away into the grass. When Jake finished, Dr. Mwangi was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful rather than skeptical. "I believe you," the biologist said finally, and those 3 words hit Jake with the force of absolution. "The tracks your rescuers found tell a story that supports everything you have described. A large male lion staying in one area for many hours, pacing in patterns that suggest guarding behavior rather than hunting behavior. There was even evidence of other predators approaching and being driven away." Jake felt something break loose in his chest, some tension he'd been carrying since the rescue, the weight of not being believed by anyone who'd heard his account. "You believe me," he repeated, needing to hear the words again. Dr. Mwangi nodded slowly. "I have spent 40 years studying African wildlife," he said, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone who chose words carefully. "I have seen things that defy conventional understanding of animal behavior. Lions are complex creatures, far more intelligent and emotionally sophisticated than most people realize. They form bonds, they grieve, they make decisions that sometimes appear almost human in their complexity. What happened to you is rare, extraordinarily rare, but not impossible." The biologist pulled out a tablet and showed Jake photographs of the site where he'd been found. The ground around the baobab tree told a story in tracks and disturbances that made Jake's heart ache with validation. Here, Dr. Mwangi pointed to a clear impression in the dusty earth. You can see where the lion sat for extended periods. And here, multiple approach patterns from hyenas, all turned back before getting close. The lion was definitely protecting you. "But why?" Jake asked. the question that had haunted him since that first impossible moment when the lion had sat down instead of attacking. Why would it do that? What could possibly motivate a predator to protect prey? Dr. Mwangi set down his tablet and leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. That is the question that makes your story so remarkable. In my career, I have documented 3 similar cases, though none quite as dramatic or extended as yours. In one instance, a lioness protected a young girl who had wandered from her village, keeping her safe for over 6 hours until searchers arrived. In another, a male lion was observed guarding an injured impala calf, driving away jackals until the mother returned. These behaviors suggest something we are only beginning to understand about the emotional capacity of apex predators. The biologist went on to explain theories about displaced parental instincts, about how animals sometimes exhibited caretaking behaviors toward creatures they would normally consider prey, especially when those creatures appeared helpless or vulnerable. But Jake could hear the uncertainty in his voice, the acknowledgement that science could describe what happened without truly explaining it. Some things, Dr. Mwangi said quietly, exist in the space between what we can measure and what we can only witness with wonder. Your lion made a choice that we may never fully understand, but that does not make it any less real. They talked for over an hour, with Dr. Mwangi asking detailed questions about the lion's appearance, its behavior patterns, the specific sounds it had made. He was particularly interested in the deliberate roaring that had summoned help, a behavior that suggested not just protection, but active problem-solving and understanding that the human needed assistance that only other humans could provide. This indicates a level of cognitive complexity that challenges many of our assumptions about animal intelligence, the biologist explained. Your lion understood your predicament and took specific action to resolve it. That is remarkable by any measure. Before he left, Dr. Mwangi made a request that surprised Jake. Would you be willing to return to the site with me, he asked, once you are recovered enough for travel? I would like to see if we can identify this specific lion, perhaps learn more about its history and behavior patterns. There may be insights here that could benefit our understanding of these magnificent creatures. Jake agreed immediately, feeling a pull toward the baobab tree and the memories it held, a need to return to the place where his life had been fundamentally altered by an encounter that most people would never believe was possible. 2 weeks later, Jake stood once more in the shadow of the baobab tree, his body still healing but strong enough for this pilgrimage back to the scene of his transformation. Dr. Mwangi had brought a small team of researchers, and they moved through the area with the careful attention of scientists gathering data from a living laboratory. The rope marks were still visible on the tree trunk, and Jake found himself running his fingers over them, remembering the feeling of helplessness, of resignation to death, of the impossible salvation that had come padding through the grass on silent paws. The researchers set up camera traps and collected samples, documenting everything about the site and the surrounding area. They found more evidence of the lion's extended presence, including claw marks on a nearby tree that suggested territorial marking, a way of claiming this space as important. Dr. Mwangi's theory was that the lion might have lost cubs recently, its parental instincts redirected toward the helpless human it had found tied to the tree. It was speculation, unprovable but plausible, and it gave Jake a framework for understanding what might have motivated his savior. As the afternoon wore on and the research team worked, Jake found himself walking away from the baobab tree, moving through the grassland with a reverence he'd never felt before. Every rock, every blade of grass, every distant acacia tree felt sacred now, part of a landscape that had taught him something profound about the connections between living things. He thought about Montana, about the ranch that suddenly seemed very small and very far away, about the life he'd lived before coming to Africa, before a lion had chosen mercy over instinct and changed everything Jake thought he understood about the world. Dr. Mwangi found him standing on a small rise, looking out over the endless expanse of Savannah that rolled toward the horizon in waves of gold and amber. The biologist stood beside him in comfortable silence for several minutes before speaking. "You are thinking about staying," he said. A statement rather than a question. Jake nodded, surprised that his thoughts had been so transparent. "I have a daughter graduating college next month," he said quietly. "I have a ranch that needs running, obligations and responsibilities that I can't just abandon. But yes, part of me wants to stay. Wants to understand what happened here, wants to find that lion and somehow thank it for my life." Dr. Mwangi smiled, the expression gentle with understanding. "The lion gave you a gift," he said. "Not just your life, but a new way of seeing the world. That gift travels with you wherever you go. You do not need to stay in Africa to honor what happened here." Jake knew the biologist was right. But the knowing didn't make the pull any less powerful. He'd spent 32 years being practical, making the sensible choices, living the life that was expected of him. The one time he'd tried to break free, to have an adventure, he'd nearly died and had been saved by something so impossible that most people thought he'd imagined it. Maybe the lesson wasn't about staying or going, but about carrying this experience forward, letting it transform how he lived regardless of geography. That evening, as the research team made camp near the baobab tree, Jake sat by the fire and called Emma. Her voice was bright with excitement about graduation, about the job offers she was considering, about the future that was opening up before her with all its promise and possibility. He listened to her dreams, heard the echo of his younger self in her enthusiasm, and felt a bittersweet mixture of pride and melancholy. When she asked when he was coming home, he found himself hesitating, uncertain how to explain that home had become a complicated concept. That part of him would always remain in this place where he'd faced death and found something more mysterious than he'd ever imagined possible. "I'll be there for graduation," he promised, and meant it. "But Emma, I need to tell you about something that happened, something important." He told her the full story then, holding nothing back, describing the lion's vigil and protection with all the wonder and confusion he'd felt during that endless night. He expected skepticism, the same polite doubt everyone else had shown. But Emma surprised him with her response. "That's incredible, Dad," she said, her voice soft with awe. "I believe you. I don't understand it, but I believe you." Her faith in him, her willingness to accept the impossible simply because he had experienced it, moved Jake more than he could express. The next morning brought news from one of the camera traps that had been set up around the territory. A large male lion had been photographed at a waterhole 3 miles from the baobab tree, and Dr. Mwangi believed it might be the same animal that had protected Jake. The biologist showed him the images, and Jake felt his heart constrict with recognition. There was something in the lion's posture, in the way it held its massive head, that spoke to him across the digital distance. "That's him," Jake said with absolute certainty. "I don't know how I know, but that's him." Dr. Mwangi nodded, unsurprised. Animals and humans who have shared profound experiences often retain the ability to recognize each other, he said. There are documented cases of people identifying specific elephants or gorillas years after encounters, even when the visible differences are minimal to untrained eyes. The decision to try to find the lion was both easy and terrifying. Jake knew he needed to see the creature one more time, to complete some circuit that had been opened during that night of vigil and protection. Dr. Mwangi agreed to guide him, though he insisted on safety protocols and backup measures that made it clear this was not without risk. "Lions are still predators," the biologist reminded him. "What happened to you was extraordinary, but we cannot assume it would happen again under different circumstances." Jake understood, accepted the risks, and prepared himself mentally for whatever encounter might come. They traveled to the waterhole in the early morning, when the heat was still manageable and animals came to drink, before the worst of the day's temperature arrived. Dr. Mwangi had Jake stay in the Land Rover initially, watching from the safety of the vehicle while the biologist assessed the situation. The lion was there, magnificent in the golden light, drinking from the waterhole with the casual confidence of a creature that had nothing to fear from any other living thing. Jake watched through binoculars, his hands shaking slightly with emotion he couldn't quite name. Some mixture of gratitude and awe and a connection that transcended the normal boundaries between species. The lion raised its head, water dripping from its muzzle, and looked directly at the Land Rover. For a moment, Jake was certain the animal recognized the vehicle, recognized his scent on the wind or some other signal that humans couldn't perceive. Dr. Mwangi said something in Swahili to the driver, who slowly turned off the engine, leaving them in silence broken only by the sounds of the Savannah and the lion's breathing. Against every instruction he'd been given, against all common sense and self-preservation instinct, Jake opened the Land Rover door and stepped out. He heard Dr. Mwangi's sharp intake of breath, the biologist's urgent whisper telling him to get back in the vehicle. But Jake couldn't stop himself. He needed to stand before this creature without barriers, needed to meet it as equals one more time, needed to say goodbye or thank you or something that had no words in any human language. The lion watched him approach, its tail flicking once in what might have been recognition or might have been the prelude to attack. Jake walked slowly, hands at his sides, his heart pounding but his steps steady, closing the distance between them with the same kind of faith that had sustained him through that long night tied to the baobab tree. 10 feet separated them when Jake stopped. He could see the slight scar on the lion's left ear, the individual whiskers that caught the morning light, the intelligence in those amber eyes that seemed to reach into his soul and recognize something fundamental and true. The lion made a sound, not a roar, but that same soft rumble Jake remembered from the night of vigil, and the cowboy felt tears stream down his face without shame or self-consciousness. "Thank you," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "I don't know if you can understand me, but thank you for my life. Thank you for teaching me that the world is bigger and stranger and more beautiful than I ever imagined." The lion stood and Jake's breath caught in his throat, but the great cat didn't move toward him aggressively. Instead, it began to circle him slowly, the same way it had circled the baobab tree, and Jake understood he was being examined, assessed, remembered. When the lion completed its circuit and stood facing him once more, it took 3 steps forward, closing the distance until Jake could feel the heat radiating from its massive body, could smell that musky, wild scent that had been his companion through the darkest night of his life. They stood there, man and lion, separated by less than 3 feet and connected by something that transcended the normal rules governing their separate worlds. Dr. Mwangi was filming from the Land Rover, documenting an interaction that would later be studied by wildlife biologists around the world, analyzed and debated, and used as evidence for theories about animal cognition and emotional capacity. But in that moment, Jake wasn't thinking about science or documentation or anything beyond the profound connection he felt with this impossible creature. The lion leaned forward, and Jake felt that rough tongue against his hand, the same grooming gesture it had used that night, a sign of affection and acceptance that transcended every boundary between species. Jake reached out slowly, hardly daring to breathe, and touched the lion's mane, felt the coarse texture of it beneath his fingers, the living warmth of a creature that had chosen mercy when it could have chosen violence. Time seemed to stop in that golden morning light, the waterhole forgotten, the watching biologist forgotten, everything forgotten except this moment of impossible communion between 2 beings who should have been predator and prey, but had somehow become something else entirely. Jake felt the lion's breath on his hand, warm and slightly sweet, felt the rumble of contentment that vibrated through the animal's massive frame, felt his own heart expanding with a joy and gratitude so profound it seemed to fill the entire savannah. This was why he'd come to Africa, though he hadn't known it when he'd booked his flight from Montana. This was the adventure he'd been seeking, not the photography or the safari camps or the tourist version of wildness, but this raw, authentic connection with something truly wild and free. The moment broke gently when the lion stepped back, its attention drawn by the sound of other animals approaching the waterhole. Jake understood that their encounter was complete, that whatever needed to be acknowledged between them had been expressed in ways that went beyond language or logic. The lion looked at him one last time, and Jake could have sworn he saw something like farewell in those amber eyes. Then the great cat turned and loped away into the grassland, disappearing into the landscape it ruled with such magnificent authority. Jake stood motionless for long minutes after it had gone, his hand still extended where the lion had been, his face wet with tears he made no effort to hide. Dr. Mwangi approached cautiously, his own expression a mixture of awe and professional fascination. "In 40 years, he said quietly, "I have never seen anything like that. The way that lion responded to you, the clear recognition and affection, it challenges everything we think we know about the limits of interspecies bonding." Jake nodded, unable to speak past the emotion that clogged his throat. The biologist put a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of understanding and support. "You have been given a rare gift," he said. "Most people live their entire lives without experiencing something so profound, so transformative. What will you do with it?" The question haunted Jake during the flight back to Montana 2 days later, during the long hours spent above clouds and oceans, traveling from one world to another. Emma was waiting at the airport, and when she threw her arms around him, Jake held on longer than usual, grateful for the simple miracle of being alive to embrace his daughter, to witness her achievements, to be present for all the moments he'd nearly lost forever. She pulled back to look at him, her eyes searching his face with concern. "You look different," she said. "Not bad different, just different. Changed." Jake smiled, thinking about how to explain that he was different, that something fundamental had shifted in him during those hours, tied to a tree, during that impossible vigil, during the moment when he'd stood face to face with a creature that embodied everything wild and free and beautiful about the world. "I'm changed," he admitted as they walked toward baggage claim. "I saw something that most people never get to see, experienced something that taught me we understand far less about this world than we think we do." Emma listened as he elaborated, her hand tight in his, and Jake realized that sharing this story with his daughter was almost as important as the experience itself. She was young enough to still believe in mystery, still open to the possibility that the universe contained wonders that defied easy explanation. He wanted to preserve that openness in her, to pass on the gift the lion had given him by teaching her that certainty was often the enemy of truth. The video Dr. Mwangi had captured at the waterhole went viral within days of Jake's return to Montana. Scientists, animal behaviorists, and wildlife enthusiasts from around the world studied the footage, debating its implications and proposing theories about what could cause a wild lion to display such clear affection and recognition toward a human. Some claimed it was imprinting. Others suggested the lion had been habituated to humans through prior contact. Still others proposed more exotic explanations involving pheromones or neurological anomalies. Jake read the debates with detached interest, knowing that none of these experts had felt what he'd felt in that moment, that all their theories were attempts to force mystery into boxes too small to contain it. The publicity brought unexpected opportunities. Jake was invited to speak at wildlife conservation conferences, to share his story with audiences who hung on every word, to advocate for the protection of lions and their habitats. He discovered a talent for public speaking he'd never known he possessed, found that his rancher's practical manner and obvious sincerity made people listen when he talked about the intelligence and emotional capacity of wild animals. The smuggling ring he'd discovered was broken up thanks to his testimony, resulting in multiple arrests and the recovery of significant amounts of illegal ivory and pangolin scales. Justice had been served, and Jake took satisfaction in knowing that his near-death experience had at least accomplished something concrete beyond his personal transformation. But it was Emma's graduation that mattered most. Jake sat in the audience, watching his daughter walk across the stage to receive her veterinary degree, and felt a completeness he'd been missing for years. This was what mattered, these moments of connection and witnessing, and being present for the people he loved. After the ceremony, Emma introduced him to her professors and classmates, and Jake found himself telling the lion story again, answering questions about animal behavior and conservation, seeing the spark of wonder in young eyes that reminded him why these experiences needed to be shared, rather than hoarded like private treasures. That evening, over dinner at Emma's favorite restaurant, she surprised him with a proposal. "I've been offered a position with a wildlife veterinary program in Tanzania," she said, her eyes bright with excitement and nervousness. "It's a 2-year commitment, working with conservation efforts across East Africa. I know it's far from home, and I know you need help with the ranch. But Dad, after hearing your story, after seeing how that experience changed you, I can't imagine not taking this chance." Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion, recognizing his own hunger for adventure reflected in his daughter's face. The ranch would be fine with Tom Parker managing it, had been fine during his absence, would continue to be fine because it was just land and cattle and buildings, important, but not more important than living fully. "You have to go," he said firmly. "You have to take every opportunity to see the world, to do meaningful work, to have experiences that transform you the way Africa transformed me. We'll visit each other, and you'll tell me stories about the animals you're treating, and maybe someday I'll come back to Tanzania and we'll search for that lion together." Emma's smile was radiant with relief and joy, and Jake realized that his near-death experience had given him more than just his own life back. It had given him the wisdom to encourage his daughter toward her dreams instead of trying to keep her close out of fear or need. 6 months later, Jake stood in his ranch house in Montana, looking at the framed photograph Dr. Mwangi had sent him. It showed the moment at the waterhole, Jake and the lion facing each other with barely any distance between them, the morning light catching them both in a composition that looked almost staged in its perfection. The image had been featured in National Geographic, had become iconic in wildlife photography circles, but for Jake it was simply a reminder of the most important moment of his life, the instant when everything he thought he knew about the world had been proven inadequate. Emma called weekly from Tanzania, her voice filled with stories about elephants and zebras and the occasional lion sighting that always made Jake's heart ache with longing and recognition. She was thriving in Africa, the way he had thrived during his brief time there, finding purpose and connection in work that mattered. Jake had sold half his cattle and converted part of the ranch into a wildlife education center, bringing school groups out to learn about animal behavior and conservation. He told them his story, showed them the video, answered their questions about what it felt like to be saved by a creature that should have killed him. The answer was always the same. It felt like being given a second chance, not just at life, but at understanding what life could be. It felt like being shown that the universe was bigger and stranger and more generous than fear allowed us to believe. It felt like grace, delivered on silent paws through golden grass, offered by a creature whose mercy would forever remain a beautiful mystery. And every time Jake told the story, every time he saw wonder bloom in a child's eyes, he felt that he was honoring the gift the lion had given him, passing forward the lesson that we are all connected in ways that transcend the boundaries we construct between species, between wild and tame, between what we think is possible and what actually exists in this miraculous world.